Hello, and welcome to the Cathleen Scott podcast. I'm so excited today to talk to you. It's our very first episode, and we are going to tackle everything marijuana. Everything from finding square groupers off the coast of Florida to your compassionate use license and your rights under the law. I am joined by my esteemed panel, and that includes Gabe Roberts, as well as Megan McCarthy and Ann Tomasello, all lawyers at the Scott Law Team. Please feel free to check out our social media at scottlawteam.com. We look forward to bringing you new podcasts each week. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, we encourage you to seek counsel.
So medical marijuana is a whole thing right now. I mean, everybody's talking about it.
Yeah.
Everybody's smoking it. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, I have employer clients that are like, should I drug test people? I'm like, sure, but everyone's going to test positive for marijuana. So what are you going to do?
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll say, like, even with recreational not passing in Florida, like, medical is still a thing. And I think a lot of people have their cards. And if they don't have their cards before, they're going to get them now.
And do you think that people with their cards think that because they have that card, then therefore they can't be fired?
They probably do. That's most likely because they haven't actually read the statute that says, like, nothing within Florida's Medical Marijuana Act requires an employer to accommodate use of medical marijuana in the workplace, and employers can still enforce a drug-free workplace policy and all that. So there's not, just because it's medical and it's being treated like a drug in Florida in a pharmaceutical way, like, doesn't actually give you the same protections that, if you have any other medication.
So I have a friend who works for a federal government contractor, and he has cancer, but he still can't, even though he could easily get a medical marijuana card, he can't use marijuana because he would lose his job because it's, goes against the federal regulation.
Yeah, I mean, even it's like federal contracting is, especially because it's legal medically in Florida, federally, it's still a Schedule I substance treated the same as, methamphetamines or whatever. Right. So you definitely can if you're a federal employee.
And it's ironic because a patient can choose, like, oh, I want to take Xanax to help me with pain or to sleep at night, versus maybe using something like a medical marijuana or smoking flower. And those choices are treated totally differently under the law. So, like, if you have a prescription for Xanax to sleep and you test positive for Xanax on a drug test and you get fired, you could argue if it's related to a disability, that'd be a violation. It's not the same for marijuana.
What is smoking flower? I've never heard that before. Is that a way of referencing smoking weed? Is it for real? I've never...
Just inhaling the devil's lettuce? I don't know. What are we talking about?
Well, I'm going to hold some space for all you non-white smokers right now. And let's just bust it out. So there's different ways you can intake marijuana. One way is by smoking it, and what you smoke is the flower. So
it's good. I'm glad our boss is explaining this to us, and none of us have any information about what this could possibly be.
I am a child of the 70s, so yeah.
Also referred to as bud. Is it bud?
Sure. Not anymore.
Oh,
only if you're a narc, right?
I actually think it's reverse. Like what you're saying is dated, and bud is like.
Oh, so whoa!
Look at me! Look at me! I'm relevant.
And trending.
I prefer to say smoking doobies with my homies. Is that what you guys?
You just crossed over 3 different generations in one sentence.
Leaning into the reefer madness. Yeah. I will say we've had success on a couple cases with medical marijuana where just because the person has a medical marijuana card and might test positive, and yes, as an employer, you don't have to accommodate the use of medical marijuana in the workplace, you're still required as an employer to go through the interactive process on accommodations, right? So if you have somebody, whether it's a job applicant or somebody who is a current employee, and they test positive on a drug screening, you can't just automatically say, all right, well, you tested positive, have a nice day. You still have to say, hey, is there something we can do to accommodate this? Now, the accommodation doesn't need to be allowing them to smoke medical marijuana, but
during the workday,
right? But you still have to go through the accommodations process and at least have a conversation. And if the conversation is the employee says, look, I really need to smoke this and I have to do it every day during my lunch break, and so therefore I'm going to be doing it in the workplace, well, that's not a reasonable accommodation. But there is a world in which a reasonable accommodation might be, look, I do this on the weekends to help me sleep. I don't do it during the workday. I'm not impaired at work. And that may or may not, even if you're not required to accommodate use in the workplace, there still may be an accommodation you at least have to go through the process of looking into.
But also, interestingly, should they be being reported as testing positive if they have a medical marijuana card?
So it's interesting. It's supposed to be a medical review officer, right? So when you get drug tested, the step one is, what is the employer's policy? Does it say I'm going to follow state law? Does it say, to your point about the federal contractor, am I going to follow federal law? That's step one. Depending on what the policy says, the MRO is supposed to say to the applicant or to the person that's being tested, tell me all the substances that you have a prescription for, and they're supposed to list this out, right? From a workers' comp standpoint, this is very common. And the MRO is not supposed to report substances that cause a fail if it's within the limits of what has a lawful prescription. But the Florida legislature was brilliant when they passed the medical marijuana statute. They don't call it, it's not a prescription, it's compassionate care license. So it is different than a script. So that's why it's being treated differently.
Right. And also, but just because you test positive for, THC on a drug test, that could mean so many things, because depending on somebody's tolerance and how often, THC can stay in your system from 30 to 90 days, which I remember back when I was a prosecutor before coming here, that was an issue with DUIs, right? Someone would get pulled over for DUI, they'd be showing signs of impairment, they get arrested, taken back to the jail, and they do a test, and the test will come back THC positive. And the question was, okay, when, right? Like, if I'm going to take this person to trial for a DUI, I'm going to have to prove that not only were they THC positive when they did a drug test 4 hours after being arrested, but also that was from something that was impairing them in the moment, not, they, smoked a doobie 2 months ago.
It's time. You can't tell time from an x-ray, can't tell time from a drug test. And you wouldn't begrudge the employer to have like sober employees during the workday, especially if they're operating equipment or doing things that could be potentially harmful. But until someone can figure out that, I think that's going to be a challenge.
So what do you recommend employers do?
I recommend employers be very transparent with their employees about what they're testing for. And they say it up front. And then they consistently test for that, and they have a plan. I do think there's a problem with the law right now where, like, you can be on pain pills or Xanax. I think, and that's treated differently because if you have a prescription for that as opposed to having a compassionate use license. And I think that's a challenge for us to have to overcome, So my advice would be transparent and have a plan. If you're going to fire people who have positive medical marijuana findings or THC findings, you're probably going to lose a lot of your workforce.
So what happens if you have an employee who is driving around with like if the workplace gets a call from those 1-800 numbers on the back of the car, and it's like, I smell marijuana coming from wafting from the smell.
I think there's a couple different buckets, right? There's the bucket of employees doing great job, no issues, no problem, does a random test and comes back THC positive. Then it's like, oh, what do I do? He's a great employee, she's a great employee, but she's test positive. And then there's that bucket, which is employee has reasonable suspicion, and for that reason you have concerns about their behavior, then you test and they're positive. That would probably be a lawful termination pretty clearly.
And then what do you think happened though? Like, I think if that person, if they fail a drug screen, you keep them on, and then they cause an accident. I mean, that can definitely, you're on notice that they were...
I don't know if you are on notice because of the time thing. It's like you can't prove that somebody's high at work. That's other than by their physical symptoms. Unlike alcohol, which whatever your blood alcohol level is at a certain time, you can kind of like extrapolate backwards with math and say, oh, then at the time of this accident you were drunk. You can't do that with marijuana. That's a challenge.
Right, and also it gets the idea of, if you're going to have like a reasonable suspicion standard, right? As far as, I tested this person because I thought there was something I noticed in the workplace, and then the test sort of confirmed what I noticed. That also puts you on a safer ground from just like general discrimination law, right? Whereas if you have a blanket drug screening policy and one employee tests positive, but hey, they're a great employee, I like them a whole lot, you know what, I'm not going to fire him. And then another employee tests positive and they're not as good of an employee, and then you fire her, well, now you've got a gender problem,
That's right.
And so you got to, that's another reason to also have some sort of additional scrutiny of, it's not just I tested positive, it's also there were these other factors that protect me from, okay, I'm only firing the female employees who test positive and not the male employees.
Yeah.
So to use one of Kathleen's favorite phrases, flipping the other...
everyone has their shit? No, a different phrase?
Different phrase.
What is it? Feedback is a gift?
Come on, what other ones you got?
So if there is an employee or a potential employee, a job applicant that has a medical marijuana card, what advice would you give them to set them up for success?
Yeah.
With letting their employer know that they are using medical marijuana?
It depends on the job. If it's a safety sensitive job, I think they should not take that job because they're going to test for that and they're going to have problems. But if it's not, and I think they should be transparent with their employer. I do. I think from the beginning.
Yeah.
And they should be, look, I have a medical marijuana. I just want to let you know I've been on this for a while. I use it for pain or for sleeping or for anxiety or whatever it is. It's funny the way that we treat that. We treat it. It's almost like we still have reefer madness, but it's like in a different way.
Yeah.
The way that we're looking at it.
And when you're being transparent, and this is the thing that, at least when I talk to people, they seem to struggle the most with, not only this, but other medical accommodations, is when we're saying transparent, like you need to tell your employer some of your medical information. And there's a lot of people who are very privacy centric and they don't like sharing stuff.
Yeah.
But this is something where it's not enough to just say to your employer, I've got a medical card and then nothing else, because that's not necessarily giving them enough information to trigger the need for them to ask follow-up questions, right? You should say, I've got a medical card. It's because of this. It helps me with this. And I'm willing to work with you to find something that we can do to make sure that I'm allowed to have this job and can work with you. But you can't just say I've got a card and nothing else.
And to Megan's point, you shouldn't be having that conversation until after you've had the interview and you're in that applicant. You've become from potential applicant to you've been offered a job.
Right.
So
Well, it's
post
scary.
offer.
Yeah, because everybody's been
But
like,
legally, no one should be asking about your medical conditions until post op.
unless they're needed as an accommodation for the interview process.
Right.
Fair point.
But no, you're right. It's when you get offered the job and they say, hey, just so you know, there's going to be a drug screening, standard stuff. That's the time to say, okay, well, hey, just so you know, I'm going to test positive for this because I have a medical card because of, I have cancer and I need this for my pain tolerance. I'm willing to work with you to find something else so we can be assured I won't be impaired in the workplace, but I'm just letting you know now.
I do think there's a perception, though, by employers that like anyone that has a medical marijuana card is just like doing it for recreational use. I mean, there's definitely
Well, I think that's because there are a lot of people who are just doing it for recreational use.
But a lot of people really do need it. I mean, it can treat a lot of conditions too, like things that you wouldn't even like Crohn's, things like that.
Yeah, and the thing what bothers me about it is like, so what if you're doing that in your spare time? Like, I'd much rather have people like smoking marijuana than get behind a car after drinking alcohol or what. Either way, I'm just saying like, if there's sort of like that stigma, I think hopefully that will change. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's like an employee's social media post, right? If what you're posting on social media outside the workplace, that should really only matter if it's impacting the workplace, right? If your social media posts are, these really, let's say incredibly anti-immigrant type social media posts, and you work in a job with a lot of people who are either from an immigrant population or come from immigrant populations, okay, maybe those posts matter because we need to make sure you're not going to take that animus towards your coworkers. Sure. But if you're just generally posting about, politics outside the workplace and it's about something that's not going to impact the workplace, then your employer probably shouldn't get involved in that.
There's something called all lawful activity laws. And so interestingly enough, in the states where like marijuana is completely recreational, like Colorado and I'm blanking on, in California, they have some of the strictest regulations on what happens in the workplace if you're using marijuana, and they're called all lawful activity regulations. So like in some states, like, oh, you're like, to your point, you're regulating an employee's conduct after hours. And it's like, where does the line end there, right? So places in Colorado make it absolutely, you can be terminated for use of marijuana, even though it's recreational use. And now if you compare that to like someone goes out and goes to happy hour, you're not going to be fired for partaking and drinking after work. But yet if you test positive for, cannabis, you're going to lose your job. I don't know. That seems to me like there seems to be like a little bit of a hypocrisy there.
Well, I think it could be a backlash that, is
everybody high?
Reactionary. Yeah. That after, it was made more widely available, like the pendulum swung back and was like, we need to get a handle on this, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I mean, and it's an issue I think we all deal with in our regular job when you're in front of a judge or anybody, and a statute says one thing, and we can take the language of a statute and try to interpret it in a very strict sense of, okay, the medical marijuana statute literally says you can't be required to accommodate use of medical marijuana in the workplace, right? It says in the workplace. And so in theory, we should interpret that strictly and say, okay, that means, of course, you as an employer, you can't be required to allow your employee to use their break to go in the bathroom and get high. That makes sense. The issue is when we go outside the workplace, and it's the same thing you're saying there, where it's like, okay, but why are we allowing them to regulate what's happening outside the workplace when the statute is very clear and says in the workplace?
Right.
What if they're on a break? What if they leave the premises?
Well, the workplace is defined. I think the statute's like during the workday. I think,
But if you're coming back to work after your break, what's the difference whether you do it in the bathroom, in the car, in the parking lot, or off premises?
Because it's during the working hours. I think that's the distinction. Right.
Well, also,
and you're impaired during the workday.
Right. Yeah. It comes down to like, how do you define what does it mean to use in the workplace, right? If it's like, if you're taking a break, let's say you go home for lunch and, you take an edible or whatever it is, and then you go back to work. Is that using in the workplace? I don't know, but that's a much closer thing as far as you're clearly going to be feeling some effects from that when you go back to work.
I'm going to read those briefs, Gabe.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be very different when you go back to work.
I think the people are kind of a little bit crazy over marijuana.
Yeah.
Like, I think that there's a little bit of like a shock and awe over marijuana. And I don't know if it's because of my upbringing that I kind of like can sit back as an observer and like look at the way people talk about it. Like I don't know. I find it to be really interesting. Like people,
the vast majority of my life, it's been illegal. So I think that there's this
stigma,
time to overcome that. It took a long time for them to overcome when they changed the seatbelt laws and required seatbelts. People were very anti-seatbelt for a very long time.
I think if you compare the way our culture looks at alcohol compared to the way it treats marijuana, there's like a lot of hypocrisy there, right? Like alcohol is poison. We like it, we drink it, but it's poison that you're putting in your body. It doesn't do anything. There are no health benefits to drinking alcohol. It doesn't solve any problems.
What about that red wine, heart stuff? What about that?
my anxiety disagrees with you, but that's...
Is that true? Okay. All right. I just find it very interesting. Like it's kind of
you're right.
I would like you to accommodate Gabe.
And I wonder if I have a more chill attitude. I mean, because my upbringing was different. I mean, my parents were very strict. My parents did not smoke, and we were not a weed-friendly house. But like, I grew up with brothers and sisters in the 70s who were obviously smoking weed. I mean, when I was like 11 or 12 years old, my brother discovered a square grouper right off the coast of like.
Tell the folks at home what a square grouper is.
But an
I
actual
don't think there's anything wrong with talking about this. I think this
like
is
a
part of
brick
the
marijuana that washed up on shore because it came off of
No,
the boat.
I'm just saying.
So let me paint the scene.
Yeah,
I grew up in
hit
Juneau
me.
Beach. It's very close to the beach, and it's a small beach, not far from where we are now. And I was on roller skates because that's what you do. And you have 7 older siblings. You don't have a bike. You skate. So I was skating around, and there comes my brother, and he's wearing his long, what do they call it?
Bell bottoms.
Bird wells. They're like long bathing suits that go almost down to your knees. They're kind of like making a comeback now. And he was like,
shorts.
yeah.
Okay.
And he's
I'm stuck on the fashion.
He's carrying something on his shoulder, and it's like half covered by a big hefty bag. And I come over, and he's like, Kathleen, just keep going wherever you're going. Stay away. And I was intrigued. And then, a few weeks later, like people are coming to our house and they're leaving, they're coming, they're going. And I'm kind of like, what's going on? And then a few weeks later, my brother buys an ATV, a very expensive thing in the 70s, and then a second one, and then some stereo equipment. And so even though I was so young, I didn't really understand what was going on. He obviously sold the square grouper. And so it was like, I don't know. And then he was like, oh, that's great. And then got into the business of doing that in a more illegal, professional kind of way. I mean, I guess it's all illegal, but.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the statute of limitations is probably passed.
Long past on that. And I was too young. But I think I grew up, and it's like, he did later go on to become a regular productive human, worked in Publix for.
I mean, it sounds like he was productive at the time.
It sounds like he was
Sounds like a businessman.
Well, that's the thing is, like, when it gets to the hypocritical part, where it's like, there's actually, like, that is just an entrepreneurial, productive spirit. It's just with a thing that we think is wrong.
And this is the point I'm trying to make. It's like, someone starts drinking alcohol, let's say in their 20s, right? They're in college. It's a debilitating, degenerative disease, basically. And so, like, if you do the same level of drinking that you do in your 20s all the way through to your 50s and 60s, you're going to end up with liver damage. You're going to end up in a mess, right? That's not true for marijuana use. Other than
going to help you.
It might, and maybe it might hurt your lungs, but it's like I find it interesting that we're like so like obsessed about the weed.
There are some arguments, though. I mean, there are some studies that show that marijuana usage by young men can either trigger or
I'm not talking about kids
to schizophrenia.
Of course.
I mean, there are.
And there's weed paranoia,
outcomes,
and there's like emphysema and things that you get with lung disease. I'm not saying everyone should go smoke weed. I'm just as an observer, I'm just observing that the way...
It feels like you're super pro marijuana and I'm super anti marijuana, and I feel like that's just a yin and yang thing. It's not like, I don't think that's necessarily
I'm not pro. I'm just observing the treatment.
On behalf of the Scott Law Team, LLC.
I don't think that anybody is like judging either way. I think that there's information that goes beyond the scope of this podcast.
But like going back to the workplace part, with it being hypocritical, it's like, the idea, and this is not as common nowadays, but it, if you go back to like business corporate culture in the 80s and 90s or whatever, right? People would take these like long wet lunches, right? You go to lunch, you have 2 martinis, and
in the 90s,
even now, like you have a holiday party. What do? You have
80s
cocktails.
Was cocaine. I mean, it was.
But
It depends
if
on
somebody
your
goes outside
industry.
and lights up a joint, people are going to hit fire alarms and freak out.
Exactly, and it's
that's
like,
my point.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, but it gets the idea of being hypocritical and like, why is there such a stigma on it? I mean, there's a political and racial component if you go into like Nixon and Reagan and all of that, where it's like this was intentionally stigmatized in order as part of the Southern strategy to like alienate black voters and a whole thing, right? And like so, but it gets the idea of if you are at a certain executive level in a company, it's like accepted and part of the tradition to like go impair yourself in some way over lunch, right?
Right.
Whereas if you're just like regular employee, part of the rank and file, you better not do the same thing.
Yeah.
It depends on the what you're doing.
Yeah.
Crack versus cocaine. In the 80s, it was like if you were on coke, it was like accepted. If you were doing crack, you were a junkie.
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting thing in the workplace. I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens. But as an observer of it, I just find it to be interesting. Like it's socially acceptable to like have a holiday party with booze or to like take a friend out to a happy hour, your coworker out to happy hour. But then it's like, but somebody might be smoking and they're off hours at their home, and then we're going to like test and terminate them for that. I just like saying that, like if an alien flew into this house and like, okay, and explain this to me, like I'm allowed to go out to a bar and drink alcohol with my coworkers and nobody cares, but like I can't. If I choose in my off-duty time to like enjoy marijuana, like I could be tested and terminated for that. Like it's kind of a hypocrisy.
Yeah,
it is for sure.
I want to go back to the transparency part though, and I think that the reason why people don't want to be transparent about it is because we all know people who have been transparent about things in their interview process, and they've ended up not getting the job because of it. And I think that creates a little bit of a fear for people to be transparent about things. But truthfully, if you are transparent from the beginning, then it can prevent you later on from that being used against you as a basis to say, well, if we had known that at the time, we never would have hired you, or we would have let you go then.
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, that gets into, what is at-will employment, right? Particularly in a state like Florida, where you can be transparent and do the right thing as an employee, whether
still get canned.
And still get canned, right?
Yeah.
If you're going through the job application process, and you're transparent up front, and they say, okay, well, what accommodation do you need? Well, really, I just need to be able to continue to use my medical marijuana. Okay, you're terminated. That's, you're at will, right? And so, yeah, we all know people, and we all have clients who have gone through that process of you're transparent, you do the right thing, but because you're in an at-will state where your employer doesn't need any reason to terminate you, they don't need to give you notice.
Right.
The only exception is if they do something that's somehow discriminatory or retaliatory, and in the context of medical marijuana, it may or may not qualify as discriminatory.
Better to have your medical marijuana card than not.
Yeah.
Keep the argument alive.
For sure. But at will is an interesting concept, right? Because a lot of people, they ask about that. They're like, what is at will? What does that mean? And I think that we talk about that in a way that's very different than how other people talk about at will employment. I mean, at will means you don't have a contract, right? Most people in Florida don't have a contract, so they can be let go anytime, for any legitimate, non-discriminatory reason. And I think that, or no reason at all, right? You don't have to have a reason. And that's a sense of frustration for people that they come in and they're like, they wouldn't tell me why. Well, we tell our employer clients, don't tell them why. Don't give them a reason to argue. Don't,
It's not debatable.
Yeah.
The history of
You
the
looked
word.
like you were going to say something.
You like stood up. I was like, all right, Megan, floor's yours.
No, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to monitor my posture. Well, I think that's really frustrating for a lot of people because they feel like, they can't just fire me for no reason, right? And people don't get it. I tell people all the time, like, it's not illegal to have a boss who's a jerk.
Yeah.
That people constantly think like
That's not fair.
Yeah, it has to be illegal that they fired me because they thought I was annoying. And usually I'm like, I'm so sorry that happened, but it's not illegal. Like, you can be, like Anne said, you can be terminated for no reason or any reason as long as it's a legitimate, non-discriminatory reason.
So it's funny that you said my boss is a jerk and it's not illegal to be a jerk. referring to anybody here.
I feel like I should say the Scott Law Team does not condone the use of marijuana, and nor do they.
Let's record that disclaimer at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah.
But we need to talk about how that is not a toxic work environment. Because that's something that we hear a lot. Oh, my boss was screaming at me all the time, throwing things in the office. Not a toxic work environment. That's not what that is.
Or hostile.
Hostile.
They'll do a Google search about like ways that's illegal to get fired. Hostile work environment. Oh my God, my work environment was so hostile. My boss would give me work assignments at 4:30 on a Friday and expect them Monday at 9 a.m. Or they would scream and yell and all of that. It's like you might have a horrible boss, but that's not toxic or hostile.
Right. Has to be based on a protected characteristic, right? Age, race, sex, gender, that type of thing.
Yeah, sometimes I'll use the example. I'm talking to people of like the movie Horrible Bosses, which I don't know how old the movie is now, but Jason Bateman
That's
and
a
Jennifer
really
Aniston.
topical reference,
Right?
Gabe.
Yeah, exactly. I've been holding space for it.
That's not holding space.
But I'll use an example where it's like the bosses in that movie are genuinely horrible bosses, and because
Right.
of that, like their employees conduct this like scheme to murder their bosses. And I'm not saying anybody should murder their boss, but also like just
If they have a peanut allergy and you want
That's just 9 to 5.
yeah, but like just because they're a horrible boss doesn't mean it's illegal
Right.
in the workplace.
And people really have a hard time like accepting that.
They really
Like,
do.
I don't know how else to tell people.
Sometimes I tell them, I said, the idea of at will is meaning at your will, you can stay or you can go. If they change the policy, you don't like it, you can leave. You have the freedom to leave.
Yeah.
But they can also fire you. I give the blue shirt example a lot. Like if you come to work and they say, oh, we don't hire people with blue shirts. You're fired. You're wearing a blue shirt. Gabe's wearing a blue sweater. You know, if you got fired, that
Makes my eyes pop. For the camera.
yeah. There you go.
You're out.
There you go. And so when I tell them, I give them a ridiculous example. Like if I decided to have a policy that said no pink shirts or no blue shirts, and someone violated the policy, even if they didn't have notice, I could just
Right.
fire them. And how stupid and outrageous that is. But that's still an example of.
Well, I'm really glad that you said that, Kathleen, too, that like I do think that kind of reminds people that employment is not only a one-way street, that
Right.
like you also have rights.
Yes.
Just like they can fire you, you can leave at any time. And like imagine if it were the other way.
Yes,
And
like indentured servitude.
yes,
Yeah.
you wouldn't want that either. So it's not a perfect system, but
But like we have to use that to segue into this whole non-compete thing because is there indentured servitude if you can't leave because you have a non-compete? I mean, that's a hot topic right now, and I think that it's rightfully so a hot topic. You know what?
I think employees are going to come into their power, and they kind of already are. You know, I mean, it's like, look how scary was it that Amazon workers were striking 4 days before Christmas. You know that it's like employees have a lot more power now, and I think there's starting to be an employee shortage. I mean, there has been since COVID, really, and it's like that's going to keep these. And so these issues, in my opinion, are going to continue to bubble up, and employees should know that they have more power now than they've ever had because
the increase of the gig economy. If you can make more money driving for DoorDash
Yeah.
than you can at whatever
Right.
regular
XYZ,
hourly job,
yeah.
at Acme Corp, then like okay, I'm gonna leave and go make my own schedule and be a contractor
Yep.
for DoorDash.
and don't sign a restrictive covenant, right? Like so, if you leave, go.
Yeah.
Right, you can drive for DoorDash and Uber Eats and
Yep.
Postmates, and you
Yep.
can do all of them. It doesn't.
Right.
You're not going to be limited.
Right. Yeah.
And the more you squeeze on people, the more likely it is that they're going to rise up and fight against it, right?
I do think there is a place for restrictive covenants and
Sure.
do not competes that are carefully
course.
drafted, things like that. But I remember in law school we were learning about the Jimmy John's case. In one of my employment law classes. Are you guys familiar with the Jimmy John's case?
Like just that they were basically giving everybody a non-compete.
Yeah, like every
no
single
matter
sandwich
what.
maker.
Yeah.
But I believe the language was that you couldn't work somewhere else where they derived at least 25% of their income from sandwiches. But I mean, that's basically every restaurant. This is America. And also, is a hot dog a sandwich? Hard to say. Put a pin in that.
That's a whole separate discussion.
But our professor was like, well, why don't someone like try and defend it from Jimmy John's perspective? Like, what is Jimmy John's legitimate business interest? And I knew a girl who worked at Jimmy John's, and they had a sandwich making competition where they show you how to make them so fast.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfectly and so fast. They even had a competition in Las Vegas. And I was like, that could be a special skill. I can't make a perfect sandwich that quick. But yeah, that's one of those examples. Like, it's clearly just hurting workers, you know?
You know, I learned that the word sandwich. Do you know where the origin of the word sandwich comes from?
The Earl of Sandwich?
right?
Yeah, the idea they play poker, and they would serve meat, and it was greasy, and the poker, the grease would get on the cards, and they were dealing and whatnot. So someone had the brilliant idea to put the bread, smash the meat in between it, keep the grease, soak up the grease. So we have Earl of Sandwich.
I wonder
Is
if
pizza a sandwich?
No.
Has bread on the outside?
I mean, it depends.
An open face sandwich.
If it's Chicago pizza, no. But if it's from New York, you fold it in half. I think maybe you can
Right.
argue that's like
Yeah.
similar to a sandwich.
I'm just, you
There's
know,
no bread in pizza.
Sure there is. The dough.
That's
that's not bread.
How's that not bread?
How is that not bread?
Because bread has a grain in it, and dough is like dough. It's like
Dough
There's
is
different
literally
things.
bread
Bread.
dough.
It's bread
It's
dough.
bread dough.
No. I
Yeah, it's
disagree.
just pushed into a round and flat.
Listen, I think we need to hold space for charcuterie because that doesn't have bread.
Well, but what if you
right?
take 2 crackers and like you use them to put like the meat and cheese between them?
I mean,
a
now you're just
Lunchable?
being crazy. That's not.
Is a Lunchable a sandwich?
It could be.
that's a cracker sandwich.
We
in my
should
book.
not have this conversation.
Wait a minute.
Because
What about a
parents around the world
s'more?
are going to kill us
S'mores
if
are
we
sandwiches.
Whoa.
mess up the. Oh,
It's a graham cracker.
did you see the new s'mores thing? That's like with a little baby brie, and they're like doing s'mores, but with brie cheese instead of
in a marshmallow?
instead of a marshmallow, and instead of graham crackers, it's like
So they
bread.
put chocolate?
No, it's bread or crackers.
I'm glad they're replacing the marshmallow because it's really gross. I mean, a marshmallow is like. I do too, but like
baby
when you-
brie and you put the bread, you put like a little bit of jam, you put the baby brie melted, and then you squish it between the other bread.
when you call it baby brie, I have this like vision of like
those little ones that they
it's
sell.
like it's like
at the
lamb or
store.
something.
Right. Is this like veal? Is it like veal where it's like
veal,
like
no,
baby
no.
brie comes from like
Yes.
baby cows?
Yeah, I don't know.
No.
Little
just a
bitty
tiny
little
brie.
dairy cows are working through the
Little
night.
individual brie.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Kathleen Scott podcast. We hope this was fun and informative. We'll catch you on the next one. You can find us online at scottlawteam.com or floridalaborlawyer.com. Thank you for joining.